there's a kind of bigger point, which is that Nigeria still has to confront the fact that the overall amount of spending that government has the space to do based on the revenues it raises is very, very low. So this picture on the left is even having removed the drain from the PMS subsidy, you're looking at roughly an 8 to 9% of GDP revenue mobilization every year, okay? Of which oil revenues can get to close to 4% of GDP, and we hopefully see some incremental gains on non-oil revenues. That's less than half of the African average, which is closer to 18% of revenues mobilized as a share of GDP. What does that mean? Well, if you've got this level of revenues and you can do some level of financing, which is capped by what is sustainable, right, and not running into debt service risks, that's consistent with spending for the foreseeable future over the next decade of less than $20 per person on everything excepting interest spending. You can see that interest spending, which is the light blue, is quite significant relative to all other forms of interest, all other forms of spending per capita. So $20 per month per Nigerian worth of government spending is not buying a whole lot of public services, education, healthcare, let alone plugging the infrastructure gap and all the other priorities that the country might have. So the bottom line is that that PMS subsidy reform was critical to stabilize the situation. It kind of avoids the cliff, but there's still this fiscal mountain to climb, if you like, which is how does Nigeria think about getting out of this current equilibrium of low revenues and low spending and perhaps low trust, right? Because no one is particularly interested to contribute more taxes if they're skeptical that that's going to result in better services. The FX reform was the second major reform, so collapsing the official windows into a single window, the INE, allowing willing buyer, willing seller pricing to happen in that INE window. I'm sure most in the audience would be pretty familiar with this market. Also in the past, not all orders were registered. Now the order book has been reintroduced, so you've got much more transparency and much more market-reflective pricing in the INE window. This was really significant because the official rates immediately basically came close to converging with the parallel rate. Previously, that premium had been one of the biggest premiums between the official and the parallel market rate in the world, which is all your opportunities for round tripping and all your economic distortion from an overvalued exchange rate. The inflationary impacts of this, we think, should be limited because of the importance of the parallel markets previously and all the pricing that went off the parallel market rate. One effect that it will have is to revalue upwards in Naira terms all of the external debt. So it will result in an increase in Nigeria's external debt burden, we think from 40 to 46% of GDP this year. But the key thing to note is because it's good for the debt dynamics and good for the economy, thereafter, debt to GDP stabilizes and begins to decline, whereas before, we were concerned that debt to GDP would just keep rising. So it's another example of kind of short-term pain, long-term gain, if you like. Okay, so that's a very quick, what have we seen over the last period of time since our previous report, which was in December, quite a lot. Implications and where to from here. So just very quickly on the kind of forward-looking and then looking forward to the discussion. So as a result of these changes, we've basically lifted the forecasts for Nigeria. So we're up by 0.5 percentage point in GDP growth projection for 2023 compared to where we were before. And by 2025, we can see GDP at more than 4%, which is a percentage point higher than where we were before. Inflation, we're going to have these short-term increase in inflation, as I mentioned, but thereafter, because it's good again for lowering the level of financing the government needs to do, that will decrease inflation, and we'll start to see inflation fall below where it would otherwise have been, we think, by early next year. The markets kind of agree with the more positive outlook. This is an example from Eurobond spreads, where the gap between Angola and Kenya as comparison countries converged, and we've seen spreads compress. So markets have been very positive about this as well. But I think we do need to be clear-eyed about, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as economists unfortunately like to say. And one of the costly aspects of this is the short-term inflation. So we expect that inflation will increase by quite a few percentage points over the next couple of months before it starts to ease off early next year. And then, drop off nicely by the middle of next year. That's basically, the one-off price effect from the PMS price increase drops out of the base at that stage. And it's good for inflation on a medium-term view, but we've got to get through this hump, okay? And that's why the bank has been quite focused on ways to meaningfully compensate, especially poor and vulnerable households, to get through this period of adjustment. And that's because even though the benefits of the subsidy were heavily concentrated on wealthier households that consume most of the PMS, even the poorest households consume some PMS, either directly or indirectly because they rely on transport or other related services and goods. So the estimate is that without any form of compensation, if you go back to that logic that price increases can push people below the poverty line, up to 7.1 million additional Nigerians would be pushed into poverty by this increase in inflation if nothing was done to compensate them for what's going on. And Nigeria, interestingly, is in a position where actually it can deliver a cash transfer to poor and vulnerable households, not as the be-all and end-all of subsidy reform, but as one aspect of this idea of having a compact and a new agreement on how to spend the resources that Nigeria does have. So there's a lot of work that's gone into this. The report has a special topic explaining the social transfer program, but maybe just some key points. There are registries in place that already cover over 15 million households in the case of the National Social Registry, which aggregates up from state registries. And there's a rapid response registry that was done in response to COVID, which is more focused on urban areas and vulnerable households there. That's almost 3 million households. So those registries can be re-looked at and revised, but they're in place. And then payments could happen to households by digital methods that are transparent and that enable money to reach households in an effective way. So a lot has progressed in terms of social protection just in recent years, thanks to technology and thanks to administrative and implementation improvements that actually make it feasible for Nigeria, where it is now, to provide support in a meaningful way to households that are being hit by these price increases. So we can go into that further in the discussion if that would be of interest. One way of characterizing it is, I know what's been in the news is the idea of a 5,000 or an 8,000 naira monthly transfer to needy households for about 6 months. If you look at the cost of that, it would be equivalent actually to just about 1 month's worth of spending on the subsidy that was happening before it was cancelled under the old exchange rate, still less than 2 months' worth under the new one. So it's not actually an enormous amount of resources relative to what's being freed up, and it might just help many poor and vulnerable households get through this without having to do things that really harm their prospects, right? Like pull a kid out of school, or not go to the hospital, or skip a meal, or whatever the case might be. The other thing we often hear is that 5,000 naira or 8,000 naira is a trivial amount of money. How's that going to help people? I think people would often actually be shocked to know that for a huge number of Nigerian households, it's a very significant amount of money. So I believe the statistic is that about 50% of Nigerian households are on less than 60,000 naira a month. So if you're giving them 5,000 or 8,000 extra for 6 months to help tide them over, you're increasing their earnings and their available incomes by, on the order of 10%. So for many households, it would be meaningful. All right, and then I mentioned that we have many other ideas about how to sort of bed things down. Let me just quickly give you a sense of those, and then I've definitely gone on long enough. So first order of business to sustain and deepen the FX policy reform. We would advocate for removing the remaining FX restrictions. So there are still restrictions on the use of FX for 43 products. That continues to drive some demand for currency into the parallel market. And it's also a conflation of trade policy with FX policy, which is which is not ideal. There are different ways of managing import demand if that's what you want to do. CBN should keep actively communicating and ensuring clarity about what the new focus is, and just emphasizing that the new approach is a unified, market-reflective, transparently determined rate. And then FX policy is not done in isolation with other policies. So in the case of CBN, the whole orientation of monetary policy towards price stability could be strengthened, and that would be really good for the Naira's value, right, including against the dollar. So issues of coordination with monetary policy. And then the whole agenda around tackling inflation is obviously a huge one, but some ideas include, reducing subsidized CBN lending to medium and large firms, ending the government borrowing from CBN. All of these things really increase the money supply, and reducing that rate of growth would be helpful to reduce inflation. And then replacing import and FX restrictions with tariffs would be helpful. And then there's a variety of other, if you like, micro measures that could be thought about, but these are just some sort of food for thought, if you like, on reducing inflation. And then to build on the PMS reform and rebuild fiscal space, clearly just sustaining the PMS subsidy removal is not trivial, because the fact that petrol prices are so much higher does create pressures. So basically keeping prices deregulated, but also ensuring that there's competition, curbing any malpractice, making sure that efficiency gains are passed on to consumers so that PMS prices can be as low as possible without the subsidy re-emerging. And then a variety of things to begin climbing that fiscal mountain that I described, to just begin to mobilize more revenues in such a way that spending can be increased to tackle the real priorities of the country. Now, obviously, that's kind of easy to say, and there are some parametric ideas like increasing the VAT rate and so on. I guess the deeper issue is that needs to come with trust building and transparency and clarity on how those increased resources are actually being spent, so that Nigerians are convinced that there is a kind of new compact underway where they can, they may have to pay more taxes in some ways, but they're getting better services and infrastructure that they value in return.